Okay, we are live. Hi to everyone watching the replay. We are just going to wait for people to trickle in, and then we'll be starting the session. Okay, good afternoon, everyone joining us in grade 7. Hope you're all doing well. I'm going to wait another few seconds so people can join. Okay, I think that now is a good time to start. So, hi everyone joining, and welcome. Welcome to those watching live. Welcome to those watching the replay. So today's webinar is the latest session in our speaker series at SEN Talk. It's called SEN Explained. So we form partnerships with professionals, lay people, and everyone in between to discuss special educational needs and neurodiversity. So we believe that fostering dialogue and providing information is the key to developing more understanding and empathy across differences. So my name is Valenza, and if you aren't already familiar with our work at SEN Talk, we're a nonprofit organization based in South London with a mission to improve social and emotional outcomes and promote inclusion for children and young people with SEN and their families. So today we're delighted to have Stephanie with us, who will lead a presentation on ADHD and emotions, a very vast topic. Following her presentation, there'll be an open question and answer session, which will take place over the chat. So feel free to ask questions at any point or comments during the webinar by typing in the chat box to the right of your screen. We kindly ask that you limit your engagement to one question with a follow-up, just to allow other individuals the opportunity if they'd like to participate as well. And the recording of today's live session will be available for rewatch on our YouTube page as you're accessing it now. And event attendees who have registered with us will be sent this link, as well as any additional resources, including slides. So I'd now like to introduce Stephanie. She was diagnosed with ADHD as an adult following the diagnosis of her 2 daughters. She's a former Magic Circle lawyer working in banking. Stephanie is currently the founder of the ADHD Advocate and the co-founder of the ADHD Unlocked membership community. She's helped educate and inspire students and their parents, professionals, entrepreneurs, and creatives to understand and embrace their ADHD, helping them to create the structures and strategies they need to achieve their goals. Stephanie is also a former primary school governor for special educational needs and disabilities, former chair of trustees of ADHD Action, and runs the London ADHD support group on Facebook. Stephanie is passionate about raising awareness of ADHD, particularly in healthcare and education sectors. So now I'd like to pass it over to you, Stephanie. Thanks so much for joining us today, and welcome.
Thanks, Valenza, and thanks everyone for joining. This is a very, important, very loaded topic around ADHD, managing emotions, because as you may already know, emotional kind of dysregulation is not covered as a diagnostic criteria under the DSM-5. So quite often, a lot of ADHD, as we know, it's not missed, it's not diagnosed, and therefore it's not treated. Basically, I would say from what I've seen, the emotional dysregulation aspect of ADHD is really the most crippling aspect, because we know that ADHDers can struggle to pay attention. We know that we can be impulsive, but and there are things that we can do around those deficits. But when we're emotionally dysregulated, it's very difficult to access all the strategies that we may have to hand, use the tools that we've got, because it's that emotional dysregulation that just literally shuts us down. And so today I just wanted to outline some of those particular traits, and more importantly, what you can do as a parent of a child with ADHD to help them manage their emotions and navigate this very difficult aspect of ADHD. Okay, so we started the presentation. So Valenza, do I just say next slide? Or I think I need to click it, don't I?
Yes, so your slides are up. Just click as
Perfect.
normal.
Okay. So just very briefly, now I have covered what ADHD is in, I think, a previous presentation I did with SEN Talk, but it's a neurobiological condition it's very much misunderstood and underdiagnosed. There are 3 types of ADHD, as described by the DSM-5. So you've got the predominantly inattentive, predominantly hyperactive combined type, inattentive and hyperactive impulsive, but you don't kind of have any specific criteria around emotional dysregulation when it sets out all the different things that you're looking for when you're diagnosing ADHD. Not currently. Now, there is a lot of talk that will hopefully change maybe in the next version. And I believe the European version of the DSM-5 has just started incorporating the emotional dysregulation aspect, which is great. So hopefully more ADHD will be picked up so that it can be treated. Now, we at the ADHD Advocate, we prefer Dr. William Dodson's more functional, experiential definition of ADHD. And this is based on the interest-based nervous system of ADHDers, as opposed to an importance-based nervous system. So what an interest-based nervous system means is that us ADHDers, we tend to engage when there are one of these elements called ICNUP present. So that's authentic interest, which a lot of us describe as like the fuel to drive the Ferrari kind of brain. Challenge, so a bit of competition, not too much challenge. That can be something that can also shut us down, but some ADHDs are very competitive and that can be motivation enough. Novelty, a lot of ADHDs struggle to do the same thing over and again. We can get very bored, and boredom is to an ADHD like kryptonite is to Superman. It can very much just shut us down. And urgency, you'll probably have a lot of your children will be doing their homework at the last minute, any essays, any school projects. If you're a parent with ADHD, same thing probably applies. The tutor house that you need to build is due the Monday, it's the Friday. So you know what you're doing that weekend. You'll be doing the tutor house. And you probably would never have been able to do it any other way. So what I see a lot in coaching, a lot of ADHD is they come to try and change these behaviors to be more kind of prepared and in control. But it's very difficult to override the machine, which is the ADHD brain. The mind, the willingness to do these things, give ourselves more time is there, but it's a matter of kind of can't versus won't. The machine, the brain is kind of more powerful than the mind, and because it's a neurobiological wiring we're talking about. So it is very hard to not do things last minute. And there are other strategies that you can use to get things done, but urgency is a very popular one. And as you can imagine, and as you've seen, when we do things last minute, what happens to our emotions? What happens to our emotional management? We become extremely dysregulated. The emotions flood in. We become overwhelmed, anxious. Very difficult to manage emotions when we're in that state. And the hard thing is, though, it's the urgency. It's those emotions that motivate us to do the thing at times. But it's a fine line. It's a bit of a balance because, as I was saying earlier, in terms of challenge, too much can make us freeze. So it's about kind of finding the right amount, and it's situational. So we'll talk a bit more about that later. And then passion. Now, this is a great one to have, obviously, as a motivator for an ADHD brain, doing something that's meaningful, that brings joy. It's those joyful emotions and positivity that we want to promote in ADHD and use that as the fuel, as opposed to that anxiety that so often is the driver. So it's just really important to be able to understand that these are the things that motivate our ADHD children. Also, if you're a parent yourself, and knowing kind of what works and what doesn't, and then becoming very proactive about the things that work and try and avoid the triggers that will cause you to be too emotionally dysregulated to do anything. Okay. So, as I was saying, emotional management is a real issue for ADHDers. Due to our ADHD, a lot of us will have a low self-esteem. We hear so many negative messages throughout our lives, And I'm sure as a parent, you probably hear yourself delivering those negative messages quite a bit. And I'm sure you carry a lot of guilt and shame as a result. And I just want to tell you that this is perfectly normal, particularly if you're a parent of a child with ADHD, to sometimes not be able to regulate yourselves. Our ADHD children can be extremely triggering. And it just doesn't make sense, does it, that if you've got ADHD yourself, sometimes your child, it's like the most triggering kind of child that you could have for your makeup. But they're your child and you love them, and hopefully you see their many strengths as well. And it's just that matter of being able to hold it together at the time when when they kick off, and to make sure that you're not, too run down yourself to be able to hold the space, because that's really what it comes down to when we're talking emotional management of our children with ADHD. Is, as the parent, it is unfortunately very much kind of up to us to be able to hold the space for them. But if you've got ADHD as a parent, space is something that we're not very good at creating, let alone holding. So that's why kind of the saying, putting the oxygen mask on first, it really is crucial. And it's not something that we do voluntarily usually. It's something that has to be kind of put in place for us, or somehow got to give ourselves permission to grant ourselves that space. It's one of the biggest challenges of an ADHD parent, but it is the most important thing we need to do if we are to manage our emotional dysregulation as well as our children's. Can't do it without space, and knowledge of ADHD and what's going on, that ADHD lens. The other thing about the emotional dysregulation of ADHD is that, under the experiential definition, is rejection sensitive dysphoria, or what we kind of term it RSD, because it's pretty long to say. Now, RSD it has a huge impact on ADHDers and on our children. So what RSD is, it's this rejection sensitivity that we feel, not just actual rejection. So say, particularly for our kids in the playground, if they're not included in a group or they're picked last, for instance, for some kind of sports game, that rejection that they feel it's crippling. It's called dysphoria for a reason. We're talking crippling pain. It's so excruciating that for many of these children, it shuts them down. It does paralyze them. Some ADHDers, though, react differently. They get very angry and very oppositional. And sometimes ADHDers will use this actually as a strategy to avoid RSD. So kind of like, if I don't like you anyway type of attitude. So they hate everything and everyone. If I hate everything and everyone, then if they reject me, I won't care because I hate them anyway. Or I hate doing that thing anyway, or that thing is dumb. So if I'm not good at it, it's dumb anyway. So you've probably seen a lot of that with your children, that they avoid a lot of activities that they might not be good at, because that RSD that they would feel as a result will just be too crippling. So a lot of ADHDers, unfortunately, don't fulfill their potential, because what's at stake is that triggering of their RSD, and it's too painful. So the other thing that ADHDers do to avoid RSD is to become people pleasers. And this will be interesting to hear what your experience is of this. But a lot of ADHDers, they will try and get other people on side, usually at their own expense, by putting everyone else's needs before their own. Now, as you can imagine, doing that, a lot of ADHDers will not know who they are anymore. And as a child, unfortunately, education don't place any emphasis on developing the child as an individual and helping them learn what their strengths are and their needs and values. And that really it really comes at a cost for us ADHDers growing up, because we're so busy trying to avoid RSD, to fit in, to not get triggered. We're all things to all people, or the opposite, as I was saying before. I hate everyone and everything. Either way, not ideal. So the first step is to understand that RSD is a key component of ADHD, and again, one of the most crippling aspects. And what I've seen in coaching, once your child knows what it is, what's happening, because it's really quite scary. Because you really, when it happens to you, even as an adult, it does shut you down. You really can't function. I see it in the workplace a lot with my ADHDs as well. It's not so much the performance, the inability to focus, the disorganization that causes these employees to have to leave the workplace. It's usually something that the employer manager has said about their performance, or say the focus is on what they're not doing well versus what they're doing, actually well. And the RSD, it just shuts them down. A lot of ADHDs are very emotional, expressive wise. There's a lot of crying with some ADHDs. And again, unfortunately, in this society, right, you cry, you show emotion, and it's a sign of weakness. And a lot of kids, they'll be bullied, or the other kids will avoid them because they're always crying, right? But it's actually a very healthy thing that they are expressing these emotions, because on the flip side, with other ADHDs that repress their emotions, don't connect with them, very much out of sight, out of mind. So using that ADHD strength to just avoid emotion, avoid, conflict. I'm just going to turn the other cheek, and that thing no longer exists. The problem, it catches up with them later. The problem is that they end up in situations and stay in them. They don't change them because, they're able to put these things out of their mind and continue going. But what are they teaching other people about boundaries, about how to treat them? And it can come at a massive cost, particularly as they grow up into adulthood. You teach people how to treat you. And if you didn't know how to do that, if no one taught you, if you don't know what you need, then that often results in what we see with a lot of ADHD families breaking up, a lot of abusive relationships. So this is so important. So it's great that you guys are here today. The more you understand this emotional aspect of ADHD, the RSD, the more able you are to help your child get in front of this, and just taking that more proactive approach for them to be able to name it, to tame it. So when they're feeling that feeling, it's my RSD, right? Like, I'm not going crazy, or I'm not losing it, for them to be able to point to something that is established and nothing to be afraid of, but it is there. And because it's wired into us, it's not something that CBT even can kind of get resolved. And we'll talk about kind of other strategies and supports around this a little bit later on in the presentation. But the first step is that they've got a name. There's a name that they can use. So it's really important to look through the ADHD lens. I remember when I first came across this, that saying, all behavior is a form of communication. And that just struck such a massive chord in me, because it's true. And I'm sure when you kind of step back, maybe not in the moment when your child has triggered you and you're losing it, it's very hard to look through the ADHD lens and this lens in terms of, well, there's obviously something wrong here. They're in pain, or they're scared. The behavior is following an emotion that they're experiencing, right? There's an emotion, or a thought that leads to the emotion that leads to the act, right, that they're getting into trouble for. But it all kind of, all goes back to, there's a thought there. Usually for an ADHDer, it's a thought of, like, I'm not good enough, or I'm not going to be able to do this. It's that, those kind of negative thoughts, the negative beliefs, because remember, the self-esteem is so low. And ADHDs have a negativity bias that's also established by research, something to do with the amygdala in the back of the brain. And the more negative thoughts we have, the stronger the connection, the amygdala. It just becomes so easy to go to the negative all the time. And so and negativity stimulates our brain. It provides us with the stimulation we need. So we get stuck in this negativity loop. So the thoughts are going to be negative, which obviously then leads these negative emotions to anxiety, to fear. And then whatever's happened, say the kids are fighting, usually because one child may have said something like, you're not very clever, are you? Or just says something disparaging. And then all of a sudden you see your child maybe kick, like what happened to me this morning, actually. One of my child kicked the other kid in the head. Apparently it was an accident. But as parents do, right? School holidays, let's maybe build a fort or something, put the mattresses down on the floor, put the movie on. We did all that last night. But the dog kept coming in. My little one had a little piglet, her favorite toy. And she was so scared that the dog was going to eat her piglet. And it was a belief founded on evidence because my dog Kingsley literally rips everything with stuffing apart. So she was very scared, and for good reason. Now, my eldest daughter, Eva, she's very hyperactive, very impulsive. And even though Eva said to my girl, Isabel, it's okay, I won't open the door and let the dog in. Yeah, well, again, based on evidence, Eva can have the best intentions, but because of her impulsivity, particularly before she starts taking medication in the morning, Eva is capable of anything. And she causes quite a lot of havoc, and it's quite amazing at how much she can get up to in literally, you turn your head and yeah, the toaster is on fire pretty much. Or she spilt milk. She's covered in milk just by opening the fridge door. Things like that. She's 13. But as you guys probably already know, it doesn't really matter the age. Even as adults, we can do things like that is very frustrating to our partners. But yeah, there was a lot of mayhem. So my youngest was worried, and the eldest, even though she was saying I won't do it, yeah, she probably was going to do it. So that behavior, why she kind of kicked my eldest, was the dog did come in the next morning, and my daughter had slept upstairs, but then she came down, and yeah, it just got a bit out of hand. And these things will happen. And even me, with my knowledge of ADHD and all the right things to do, they still have ADHD. And actually, my eldest and my youngest have autism as well as ADHD, which compounds the problem. When you've got autism and ADHD, in terms of emotional regulation and dysregulation, rather, we're talking another level because of the autism and all the sensory triggers, right? And autism being like a disability of trust, because that's what it is, disability of trust in terms of trusting their bodies, other people, the world around them, right? There's already so much fear. And then you add to that sibling that has the same kind of issues with hyperactivity, impulsivity. And yeah, we're talking very difficult situations at home. And it can be very, very challenging when you're a parent with ADHD, like I am as well, and I'm sure some of you are, to be able to hold the space, to be able to manage your own emotions, which is crucial first, so that you can see your child through that lens in terms of all behavior is a form of communication. Something here, there's a worry here, there's an emotional need here. What's going on? Being able to hold the space for you to be able to find out what that is, and kind of collaborate with your child, as opposed to yelling and don't do that. And because the thing is, with our children with ADHD, when they don't feel understood, they tend to get angry. Understandable, right? As adults, when we're not, when people don't understand us, our needs, and that's, if we're able to express them in the first place, if we know what they are, firstly, you've got to know what your needs are, you've got to express them, and then you've got to kind of be able to ask for what you want instead. Now, these steps, so many of these steps, the first one, adults struggle to do, let alone our children knowing what's going on. They often don't. And so it is just that behavior that it just comes out that we're dealing with. So it's about helping them understand what's going on, right? The more they understand, they're able to look through that lens. The more you're able to look through that lens, the better able you will all be able to manage the turmoil of emotions that inevitably come with ADHD. Okay. So just really hope that was a good illustration of how important this is, and why understanding ADHD, particularly this component of emotional dysregulation, is paramount if you want to raise happy, healthy children, and you enjoy, and that you can enjoy being a parent, right? Because it's no fun, is it? Like when you're just fighting fires all the time and feeling guilt and shame, and yeah, it can be really toxic. When you don't understand what's going on, when you're using techniques and strategies that may suit neurotypicals but don't seem to have any effect or actually make the ADHD and undesirable behaviors worse, it can feel very hopeless. And I went through that before I understood about ADHD. I didn't know anything about it. It was my eldest daughter, Eva, that got diagnosed. Before we knew she had ADHD, we were using things like timeout, the naughty step. But because of her hyperactivity, she kept coming out of the naughty step. And then again, the neurotypical kind of booklets, they say, put them back. Yeah, well, that was a fun game, wasn't it? Because Eva is very physically hyperactive and impulsive. So the poor child, we weren't setting her up for success because we didn't know. We didn't know. And again, that's okay, right? We didn't know. And when you know better, you do better. And that's why you're here, to learn more. And this is hopefully just part of your journey, and that you're going to continue to learn more, because the more you learn, the more you communicate and teach your children and help them look through that lens, then they're going to be able to manage their own emotions, right? One day, because you've modeled good emotional management and compassion to them. So that's what we're trying to do here. So I really like this little formula here, E plus R equals O. So the event and your response equals the outcome. And you can't change the event, but if you change your response, you can change the outcome. Now, it could be that there are times where you could maybe change the event with a bit of forward planning. And we'll talk about this in terms of steps for you guys to take, identifying the triggers. So I'm sure there are certain times of the day, certain demands that you're placing on your child or society or their education institution, demanding on them, that are going to be triggering. And if you can remove the event, and so you can either, there may be ways, things that you could just do away with, or perhaps there are some cushioning or scaffolding you can put around that event. But just the first step is to create space and identify the patterns. What are the things that are leading up to the outburst, to the emotional dysregulation, right? And then literally writing those events down, coming up with a plan. And we do this in coaching. We actually have an online parent course that has the exercise, and you can specify what those triggers are with the solutions as well. So the event, as far as possible, we want to either the triggering event eliminate or mitigate against the effect of it. Now, your response. So often it is our response, unfortunately, that does escalate the problem. Now, I remember early on with my eldest in particular, I started observing my responses and her reactions to them. And I noticed that if I became more angry and more directive, then it's like I fed the fire. She would meet me. The more I escalated, she would escalate, and we would just escalate to ridiculous proportions that everyone's upset, and it's definitely not what you want to be doing. Then I started, learning more about ADHD and learning about all behavior as a form of communication, and holding the space and creating space for myself to hold the space. And then once I started doing that, and I kind of would ask her, what are you feeling? I can see you're angry, or I can see that you're frustrated, and just asking her questions rather than assuming, because that's one thing that ADHDers can't stand as well, when other people, particularly the parents, just assume and kind of, this is what's happened. That is not going to do us any favors as parents to take that approach. Our children, they want to feel heard. So often, particularly in education, they're not heard. They're not seen. Their intentions are always misinterpreted. They're always told these negative messages: you're lazy, or you're being disruptive. Whereas in fact, often they're just trying to move in order to engage their brain or asking questions to get clearer, but then they're just, berated for it. And it doesn't do them any favors. And often if a child thinks that they're going to get nowhere, they're going to keep being misunderstood by that person, they kind of shut off. They're not going to listen. They don't kind of give you, they'll stop respecting that person because that person doesn't understand them. And so they won't listen to them. So it is so important. Our approach to them is so important. If they feel as if we are taking the time to hear them out, if they know we truly see them, which with a child with ADHD, that means looking through that ADHD lens. If they know and they can hear that you're kind of looking through that lens and you're empathizing with them, you're kind of present with them, which again, ADHD parent, really difficult to do. But it's that you're there with them and you see them. And that fear, right, that they're feeling, particularly as the parent maybe escalates it and maybe is assuming the wrong thing and the ADHD child's getting angry and angrier, all of that, it just reduces because they can see you get it, you understand, because that literally is the biggest kind of trigger is you don't, and I'm sure you guys have heard it with your children, you don't understand me, you don't get it, you don't understand, you don't understand. Then they feel alone. And when they don't know what's going on with themselves, when they don't understand their ADHD, it's scary because they're doing things that, like their emotions, they're so hard to manage. And often they're going to be telling themselves that they're going to develop a narrative that they're bad people because they may kick, they may hit impulsively because the emotion, they're so flooded that they can't help themselves, right? But maybe it was the sibling that started it or the sibling that said something and then their RSD kind of triggered, and because they don't know what's going on, or haven't had any support, and then they do some damage and then they get picked up for it. And yeah, it then becomes very unfair. They get angrier and angrier. The angrier they become, the less they're going to collaborate. Okay. So it's really, really important that we create that space and look through that lens and be very present with them. Okay. Because then we've got something to work with. Okay. And these kids are, a lot of them really well-meaning, beautiful people, big hearts, want to do good, want to do well, thrive, with your praise and your support. So we want to cultivate that. We want them to be the best versions of themselves. So yes, it's our response. We want to be responding, not reacting. Easier said than done, I know. Because when you're a parent with ADHD, parenting a child with ADHD, it is really difficult. Almost 50% of families with at least one child diagnosed with ADHD have at least one parent with ADHD. And I have to say, in coaching, the kids that we coach, there's always at least one parent I've seen with ADHD, either diagnosed or not diagnosed, but usually end up kind of getting a diagnosis. The more they get to understand ADHD, they have a few light bulb moments of their own and can see it in themselves. And it's such a great thing, actually, when a parent can see that they have these same issues, because presto, that lens is going to be a lot clearer, a lot sharper. They're going to understand that their child, like them, have these same difficulties. So they're going to develop more compassion, hopefully. And what's more is that they can then get support for themselves to better emotionally regulate themselves. And one such tool is ADHD medication. A lot of people don't understand that ADHD medication does a lot more than just improve your focus and reduce that impulsivity. It actually has a huge benefit in terms of emotional regulation. It's kind of one of, and a lot of ADHDers, when they're first diagnosed and medicated in the coaching, because I get to kind of hear exactly what the experience is for them, they're always like quite surprised, really surprised at how the anxiety is much reduced. they are surprised that all these thoughts that would be intruding in their heads, all the constant thoughts and negative kind of thoughts, that suddenly they've gone away, right? Because those thoughts, that anxiety, that causes that emotional dysregulation. So the medication is really quite significant in terms of treating this emotional dysregulation. It's not everything, though. The pills don't give skills, and that's what we're going to talk about in terms of these strategies. You've got to have that lens. You've got to understand what you're dealing with, and then there's all those kind of CBT, DBT strategies in terms of, what you do in any particular situation and being proactive about creating new, more positive thoughts, for instance. So if you are a parent of a child with ADHD, do be open to perhaps that maybe you may have ADHD as well. And that could be why you are triggering, their behavior is triggering you so much and your anxiety is going through the roof, because it may be that your ADHD is being exacerbated by your child's ADHD. So creating the space to hold the space, ADHD or not, we need to be able to hold the space for our children with ADHD. The only way we can do that is we have to create space for ourselves. We need to prioritize self-care to replenish our energy, to make sure we've got enough in our tank to be able to keep perspective, keep our tempers, right? To be able to think ahead and set our kids up for success. We need space. We just firefighting and reacting is just keeps us in the cycle. It keeps us in that whirlwind of life that we so often experience when we have ADHD, and we can't get out of it. We need to step out of the whirlwind. We need to create that space, step out of the whirlwind, and identify what's going on, what can we do to make the situation better, and then also, what can you do to self-care, to look after yourself, so that when you're in these arguments and face these conflicts, which will still happen, you want to be able to come out of it knowing that, yes, you held the space and that was fair what I did, and this should be the right way getting out of this. So really important to schedule that time in. Now, if you do have ADHD as a parent, you're not really going to be able to do this by yourself. We kind of, again, putting our needs last, all that work that needs to be done, or the needs of the children need to be met. So we put ourselves last on the list. And how does that usually go for us? Not usually very well, does it? Because it means that when our children really need us, right? When they're having these conflicts, when they're looking to us to be their rock, sometimes we just don't have anything left. We have nothing. And when we have nothing, we can't help. So even though you think perhaps you finished work and you haven't seen the kids all day, so you think, I've got to get down to them, I've got to be there for them. That's what a good mum does, good dad. That's what a good parent does, is just there for their kids like that. But really, if you haven't taken space, if you haven't recharged your batteries, done something for yourself, if there is an argument, or if your child's emotionally dysregulated, is having some kind of crisis, you're not going to have anything in the tank to actually be there properly for them. So it's really important that, get out of your own way, maybe arrange to have a walk with your friend, or get a personal trainer, or just schedule it in your calendar. But just put whatever you need to put in place to create space so that you can self-care, so that you can hold the space. You got to work out what your needs are. Okay, well, what are your needs? What do you need in order to keep that tank full and full enough to hold the space? And then you've got to set boundaries. Yeah. And that's another thing that ADHDers really struggle with. And again, another reason why we become so emotionally dysregulated all the time is because we don't create boundaries. We don't communicate or maintain them. If we have boundaries, we're very quick to just drop them when someone's in need. And that's not doing anyone any favors. It's certainly, you may think that you're doing someone a favor by dropping your boundary, but let's be honest, it always comes back and bites us and bites them. It's quite often a lot of ADHDs will say yes to things, make promises because they want to help. They do want to do these things. We do want to help, but only to have to say to them, I'm sorry, I can't do it anymore. And then we've gone and disappointed people. And then you can imagine the guilt, shame, we beat ourselves up again. We just go right back to the place that we were trying to avoid. So it's really, really important that we create space to identify those needs and set those boundaries. So naming it to tame it, what we talked about before in terms of identifying the triggers. What sets your child off? It could be maybe it's not giving them enough transition time, for instance. Perhaps you have not given enough margin, like in the day, in the morning, perhaps for the child to get ready for school. And you haven't, maybe you got distracted if you're a parent with ADHD, and instead of maybe just kind of, making sure your child, has got their shoes or, ready, they're ready in that stage of the routine, you've kind of got distracted. And then you can look at the clock and it's, oh, I've got 5 minutes and, well, now we really need to hurry. And then you find yourself rushing your child and kind of barking at your child, demands and commands and overwhelming them. And then you find that they're not doing the things. And then you kind of know that I didn't really set this up very well and we're kind of late because I got distracted too, but you're starting to get anxious. And so your demands and maybe your tone gets a little bit more exacting and impatient. And so you're triggered and we actually trigger them even more. And it's actually less likely now that they're going to get those things done in time because now they are angry and a lot of them become oppositional and then the morning is just an absolute mess. So create some space, have a look. What times of day are the most problematic for you? And what do you need to change? What margins do you need to add, or what systems can you put in place to make sure that these things go more smoothly? Okay. Now, the opposite of rejection sensitive dysphoria is recognition responsive euphoria. Okay, now this is powerful, really, really, really powerful. And I'm sure you've seen this with your kids yourself. When we recognize and praise our child for what they do well, what do we start seeing? We see more of that positive behavior. Okay. Children with ADHD, they really do want to please us. They do. I know often it doesn't look that way, doesn't seem that way, but they do. They want nothing more than to do the right thing, to please you. And it's that recognition, that praise that fills their tank up like nothing else does. Now, as a parent, we're in that position to be able to give them that fuel. A lot of us don't do it though, because again, we trigger, we're frustrated. Perhaps, we're just so tired from doing everything and picking up the mess and being on them that we don't create that space to be able to reflect on what they do well and to actually communicate that to them. But it's so important that we do that because recognizing their effort and intent, it really gives them that motivation to do better. So promoting those good behaviors, and it really improves their self-esteem too. Well, I can do that. Like, it's the ADHD children with parents that understand their ADHD, can look through the lens, can have that compassion, that can help them focus on what they do well, on their strengths, and create situations where they can leverage those strengths. It's those parents that really kind of help that child with ADHD thrive, not just in spite of their ADHD, but because of their ADHD. And that's the kind of parents I'm sure that you want to be, that you can be. But again, it's just about educating yourself, creating space, right? And being able to respond and not react and set your child up for success. So just recapping then, top tips for managing emotions: look through the ADHD lens. That's number one. Understand the ADHD, whether it's your child's or your own, and really kind of be able to interpret their behaviors with that lens that we talked about, all behavior is a form of communication. So that's really vital. And you can learn more about ADHD through doing our online parent course. We've also got ADHD Unlocked membership community. We do weekly webinars on ADHD, and all the recordings are there. So it's we can talk about that later, but it's a great membership community. Creating space to respond versus react. Creating space, again, crucial, right? If you've got nothing in the tank, okay, you can't hold that space for your child. So we want to be creating that space to be able to, self-care and have enough in us to be able to hold the space. Naming it to tame it, that ties in with that ADHD lens. Without that knowledge of ADHD, you wouldn't know about rejection sensitive dysphoria, for instance, RSD. And every time in coaching, when I'm talking to someone and telling them about RSD for the first time, it's really like a revelation for a lot of ADHDers. And it's such a relief for them that there is a name to this thing that they will try to avoid at all costs, right? Or that completely cripples them, because that's that first step, naming it to tame it. And it's also identifying what those triggers are, and being able to name the feelings. A lot of ADHD is really, again, because they can, out of sight, out of mind, avoid the emotions, that they don't know what they are. They can't put a name to them. And that's a problem. So there are like emotion wheels. There's, those wheels, and they've got all the emotions. You can get those kind of on the internet. There's like pictures, I think, cards with the faces and things like that as well. But helping your child identify their emotions and expressing those emotions, because a lot of kids with ADHD, when they get really emotionally dysregulated, they can't communicate, not verbally anyway, and they certainly cannot express what they're feeling at the time. So it's about developing that language for them. A lot of ADHDers can't find the words. So you help them, you give them that language, and they will be so grateful, for instance, when you can say to them in the moment when they're really upset, say their sibling stole something of theirs or destroyed it, and you can say, wow, look, you must be feeling so, so frustrating. You must feel so frustrated at the moment at your sister. You must feel really like it's really unfair that they've done this, and you must be so sick of this happening all the time to you. And then just the fact that you can describe the experience, and I see this in coaching a lot, for an ADHD, someone that can articulate, give them the words for the thing that they're feeling, this, they go from here to like, okay. And it's when they've kind of, breathed out, exhaled, that you can then really reach them. Because if they're like this all the time, they don't know what's going on, you don't know what's going on, or you're getting it all wrong, they're not coming down. They're going to stay here, and you're not going to get anywhere. Collaborate. So asking, don't tell them, collaborate, ask them questions. And that's actually why coaching is so massively effective for ADHDers, is because we're getting them to process. We're also honoring them as a person, where we're respecting them. We're not telling them. We're not. And because the thing is, when we tell, it's an instant RSD trigger. Because if you're telling your child what they need to do or how they should do it, then you're basically, or at least in their heads, they think that you're saying, you're not very clever, you're not capable of doing this, I have to tell you everything. And that's not going to get you anywhere either, right? So, use a coaching approach. Ask, don't tell. Counter RSD with that recognition responsive euphoria. So, really catch what they're doing well and express it, and be descriptive in your praise. Okay. So, because the more specific you are with them about what it is they're doing well, then they know exactly what it is that is good about that action. If you just give some kind of generic kind of praise, they don't quite know which part you thought was good. And ADHDers need specificity. Quite often, a lot of emotional dysregulation can come from ambiguity. ADHDers need certainty and can feel very anxious when they don't have all the information. So the more kind of you give them, and I guess it varies from ADHD to ADHD, but again, ask them what helps them. Whether they need to know the whole context, or maybe you're one of those ADHD parents that gives too much information and can maybe monologue may be a bit too much and you've lost the person you're talking to, in which case then maybe your child can kind of help you communicate it in a more succinct way that would actually reach them, right? So it's a two-way street. It's a two-way thing. And then get support. We talked about ADHD medication, hugely impactful. And actually, there's specific medication that can be taken for rejection sensitive dysphoria specifically. And I think they're called the alpha agonists. You can talk to a psychiatrist about those medications, but the medication makes a huge difference. Therapy, make sure though that that therapist is ADHD informed, because if the therapist doesn't understand ADHD, it can do more damage. I've seen it in coaching. A lot of people that have come to me after having therapy, if it's not a therapist that gets ADHD, it can actually be a more damaging experience for that ADHDer, because it just reinforces that negative narrative that they have. So that's not good. We don't want that. So if you want any recommendations, let me know. And coaching is transformational for ADHDers. Got all that evidence myself with clients, and there's just I think just general research about the effectiveness of coaching, because it's a collaborative approach. It's basically based on the ADHD being the expert in their own life, and they know themselves. They may not be able to name the feelings, maybe recall the things that happened, but that is part of the coaching process, is to help them uncover and unearth the things that work for them, and then start kind of implementing those things strategically and proactively so that they can thrive. So they're our top tips. And remember, you're not alone. We can help. The goal for ADHDers, as Dr. Hallowell says, is interdependence. Interdependence, not independence, right? And we can talk about that another time, the body double strategy and things like that. But it's very true. ADHDers, we thrive usually when we have other people to do things for, to do things with, to sense check with. We feed off their energy, that dynamic, the right dynamics. So yeah, interdependence. And we should be kind of leaning into the areas of our unique brilliance. And later on, obviously, maybe not in education, but getting the people in place to fill in the holes for, say, admin and stuff, other things that we're not good at that will only drain us. So we can become more strategic later. But in education, this is difficult. Children with ADHD do struggle because they can't choose their situations most of the time. So as far as possible, as parents, our job is to help educate them, support them, champion them, and look at themselves through a more positive lens, and just be there for them, right? And know that they're understood, that we can see them, we can hear them, and we love them, right? So yeah, ADHD Advocate, we've got coaching, we coach parents, children. We've got an online parent course where a lot of this material we spoke of is in this course, with worksheets that you can do. It's all online, and all of our clients do a monthly meeting. They can come for parent support, and our ADHD Unlocked membership community. So maybe I'll send this stuff to Valenza, and she can maybe distribute it. So that's it. Hopefully that was helpful.
Yes, Stephanie, thank you. That was very helpful. It's always very interesting. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll open up the floor now if we have any questions, comments following the presentation. And if you don't, you can always just mull it over. And if you have any questions, you can send it over to Stephanie or to myself, and we can sort of guide you to the right answer and provide that answer.
Yeah, no, feel free. I can put my email address, website, perhaps. Will you be sending some information to register people that have registered, Valenza?
Yeah, we'll do. So everyone that's registered will have that. We can send all those details. Maybe it'd be useful just to would it be useful to put your email in the
chat?
Is it the live chat here? Yeah, just so everyone has it.
Okay. So Stephanie. Okay, so that's my email address, and I've got some really helpful resources on the website as well, like fact sheets. There's actually a parenting tips fact sheet, which I think people would really find helpful as well. So I'll just send as that's the website, and you can also, and this is the the ADHD Unlocked membership community website as well. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's my email address, the website, and the ADHD Unlocked membership community, which, in that community, we've done like a whole week on rejection sensitive dysphoria. We've done a week on communicating your ADHD, obviously on parenting, workplace accommodations, relationships. Yeah, a lot. We've done about, I think, over 50 webinars. Yeah, I think this week we're doing simplifying your life. This week we're doing simplifying your life. We've done webinars on decluttering. Yeah, and actually we did one on managing emotions.
That's great.
And managing anger. Actually, that was managing anger and managing conflict. So anyone that joins ADHD Unlock can watch those webinars too.
Fantastic. We do have a question here in the comments. Can you suggest where to get a diagnosis as an adult?
Okay. Now the problem at the moment, via the NHS, we're talking, a couple of years wait. There's a lot of demand now for assessment. It's just really increased over the pandemic in particular, I believe. And even private psychiatrists have waiting lists, but I do have a number of private psychiatrists that I can share. I can maybe send you that list, perhaps, Valenza, and you can distribute that.
Yeah. So for the commenter who's asking, if I'll send a follow-up email. So if you just reply back to me, I can send you that information, just so it's not shared with everyone.
Yeah, no, that's fine, because usually your first port of call is your GP. So you go to your GP and you tell them that you suspect your child or you have ADHD, and then it should be your GP that then refers you for assessment. That's on the NHS, but again, a long wait. So your other option is to go privately. So I'll send you those recommendations.
Okay. I'm just gonna post I've just posted my email in the chat for that commenter. If you want to reach out directly, we can figure that out. But thank you for that.
Yeah.
So I think we can leave it there for the question and answer session. Again, if we have any other questions, we can answer this at a later time, I suppose.
Do you have any questions, Valenza?
No, not at the moment. I had a few that came up during the session, but I didn't sort of tether them. So
hopefully I addressed some of them later on.
Right. It was my first time hearing the opposite of RSD, the euphoria.
Yeah, RRE.
What was it?
Yeah, well, RRE, recognition. Recognition responsive euphoria.
Yeah, that's very interesting. That it's termed, and that's very interesting.
Yeah, that's Dr. Hallowell.
And where's that doctor based out of? Is he
the United States, of course? That's where
that's where the hub is of information.
Yeah, definitely Dr. Ed Hallowell and Dr. William Dodson. Really, they're like the kind of the godfathers of ADHD, I would say. I'm always kind of quoting them, referring to them. I really like Dr. Hallowell's strengths-based approach. You've got to take a strengths-based approach to ADHD if you want to thrive with ADHD, and the more strategic the ADHD generally is, the more able the ADHD can give themselves permission to be able to outsource, not do the things that they're not interested in. and not kind of feel guilty or like deficient because of it. They're the ones that succeed, that thrive, that have that healthy, self-esteem. Like, just because I can't do this admin stuff doesn't mean, there's something wrong with me or I'm not capable. And being able to see that, well, quite often they can do the stuff that many neurotypicals and other ADHDers, actually, if it's not their area of interest and things or ability, but they can do really well in some things that some people could never do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So it's about, I guess, creating that wider perspective for oneself. And I think you mentioned, which is a really good point, is recognizing interdependence, how we do rely on our support system around us and how we can utilize that support. And I think that's huge.
It is massive. Like, and just one point just on that quickly, it is like, it can be the difference between life and death, really, because a lot of ADHDers are very vulnerable, particularly women with ADHD. They're vulnerable to kind of gaslighting and, not having not having a correct perspective and that ability to be able to take themselves out of dangerous, abusive situations. And but if they were leaning on friends and if they were sharing and were kind of more vulnerable, it's the friends, it's the networks that can, get around them and help them out of these situations. So yeah, whereas if they're thinking independent and I need to, look good and portray no weakness and not tell anyone, no,
Yeah,
we do not want that.
it's that sort of piece of radical acceptance, isn't it? Just saying that my experience is okay and that these feelings are okay and they're coming up for a
And to
reason.
ask for help.
Yeah.
And to be vulnerable enough to be able to ask for help and show weakness, because as you can imagine, rejection sensitive dysphoria doesn't readily allow us to do that, because that's admission that we're not, that there's something wrong with us if we're asking for help. So that's why it's so important that RSD is identified and kind of named and tamed really early on.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's huge.
Yeah.
That's huge, yeah. We have another question from Natasha. Do you believe ADHD kids who are high functioning, in her terminology, who are high functioning ASD can thrive in mainstream secondary school? So I don't know if that's questions too specific, but I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, unfortunately, it depends on the school, right? It depends because no two ADHDs, same with autism, I guess, looks the same. My daughter who's both ADHD and autistic, she goes to a specialist school. We did have to take her out of the mainstream because for her, the big classes at school were, she was too sensory. She couldn't actually hear the information, take it in and process it. It was too noisy, but also not just the auditory, but visually as well. And there being so many people and visual stimuli, she needed more kind of smaller classes, which she's getting now. I got her an education, health and care plan, which wasn't easy, which I've covered in a different talk that I could always share those details if you'd like to look at. But it really depends on the SENCO at the school. It depends on how well resourced the school is, because there are some mainstream schools that have incredible SEN support, because a lot of the kids, I think they get that pupil premium. So it's interesting, even, in the more disadvantaged areas, some of the mainstream schools, so much, more supportive, because they've got a much bigger budget than some of the other mainstream schools in more affluent areas. So yeah, we have something like that in my borough, actually. And yeah, it's so it really depends on the SENCO, the I guess the governors as well, and their knowledge of SEN and their willingness to support SEN, because it really does vary. So I guess my advice to you, if you're looking at a particular mainstream school, is to get in front of the SENCO and find out what she knows about, ADHD and autism, and the kinds of support that their school is providing for that cohort of children, and what kind of outcomes they're achieving.
Yeah, I second a lot of that with a lot of the advocacy work we do. Is every child's completely different, and I think the challenge that we see with the use of functioning labels is sometimes it can like gloss over some of the support needs. So just because maybe your child appears more high functioning doesn't mean that they have other areas of support. So I think that's important too, is before you maybe the child goes into that environment, is just identifying, do I really understand what those underlying needs are, even though the child appears to be doing well in these XYZ, maybe in academics. That's important to get the whole picture.
That's a really good point, Valenza, because the high functioning term, it can cause us a lot more harm than good, because people will generalize, and then some really important needs can get missed that make all the difference in terms of not being met, that can then mean that the educational outcomes and they just won't be met. So just looking at the individual child's needs, every child's different, making sure.
I think in that, just to wrap that point up, is there's an article we posted on our Facebook page recently that sort of went into this a little bit more, and it said, instead of looking at autism or any form of neurodiversity as a gradient, it's looking at it as just that every child has uneven skill sets, uneven support needs, uneven strengths. And especially with autism, we see that looking at a gradient often can deny that child's reality in some ways, or, so I think it's hard to compare when we look at, or it's not useful to compare when we look at high functioning, low functioning, mid functioning, because it doesn't give us any information about that child's experience. But anyway, it's a whole topic, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll have one last question here. So, do you have any advice on how puberty affects ADHD, ASD?
That's funny you asked about that, because I'm going through that with my oldest daughter right now. I can tell you, unfortunately, it exacerbates the traits, the problematic traits. You'll find, and actually a lot of children, teenagers with ADHD, they get their medication, their dosage increased at the right times of their cycles, because what happens is the medication even becomes less effective during different times of the cycle. So, things like puberty, menopause, you find that the ADHD and if they've got autism, probably from what I've seen with my eldest daughter, they're just, her hyperactivity increases. She definitely becomes more impulsive, and it really does cause havoc, unfortunately. So just watch for those periods, and it's good to kind of maybe start tracking, right, how the symptoms fluctuate during the different times. But and then if she is on, if she is on medication, then it could be that you talk to a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist may be willing to increase the dose just before usually the period.
And Jackie, just a follow-up question there. She says, what about boys? So if boys are less, I guess we can't predict, unlike girls.
I've only seen the research on kind of girls and women. Not sure. That's a good question though. I'm interested to see. That's interesting. But definitely, I mean, because puberty for them and the hormones. I would assume that the same kind of thing would apply. But I'll look into that. I'll look into that and get back to you. Thank you for that question.
Okay, so I think we will wrap it up there. Thank you so much for those watching, and I hope it was a useful session. Thank you, Stephanie, so much for your time and energy, as always.
Pleasure.
It's a wonderful session. Thank you.
Have a good day.
All right, take care. Bye, everyone.